16 until the front stabilized near Carzano. It was actually kind of strategically important, but had been quiet for over a year. So in July, an Austro-Hungarian soldier had slipped through the wire there and presented himself to the Italians. He had a sealed envelope and said he came to parley. The envelope contained plans of the Austrian defenses in the region and a note signed Paolino that said he wanted to help the Italians. Major Cesare Finzi was the Italian head of information there, and his data confirmed that the maps were authentic. Eventually, a meeting with Paolino was arranged. Paolino turned out to be Ljudevit Pivko, a Slovene lieutenant, and he was a member of a sort of secret society within his army called the Sokol. It was a Slavic nationalist society, and their goal was for Italy to win the war. The treasonous Pivko pointed out that an Italian breakthrough in the Sugana Valley would take Trento and, combined with an Italian attack from the west, cut the Trentino salient in half. He thought some of his officers would support him, as well as the Serbs, though not the Bosnian Muslims or the Croats. Finzi says that if Pivko can get support and feed him information, maybe they can do something. Finzi was fairly unusual among Italian officers in that he wanted to see the Austro-Hungarian Empire destroyed, not just defeated. Pivko did what he said he would, and with a network of 52 contacts by August, outlined his plan to open the front at Carzano. The Italians would attack with 30 or 40,000 men, and if they could overrun the city before reinforcements arrive, they'll have the lower Trentino. Finzi is worried, though, that word will get out if he goes to high command through the normal channels, so he tries to get the ear of Army Chief of Staff Luigi Cadorna. Cadorna, however, is busy planning the offensive that just ended last week, so Finzi goes to his sector commander, General Etna, instead. Thing is, Austria has anticipated Cadorna's offensive and has taken away forces from the Tyrol to prepare for that. And Pivko says this is now a golden opportunity. Etna, however, doesn't really take the idea seriously and only thinks of a small local attack. Pivko by now has a detailed plan for the Italian attack involving timelines, troop strength, how to sabotage the Austrian phone lines and barbed wire, everything. The loyal Austrian troops are even going to be drugged with opiates in their brandy, and the forward troops chloroformed, right? Finzi finally gets Cadorna's ear early in September, but Cadorna takes Etna's recommendation for a limited sortie along the Sugana Valley without the concurrent attack from the west, frustrating Finzi. Meanwhile, Pivko's plot is denounced by a Czech acquaintance, but the authorities end up arresting the accuser for lying. Austrian Emperor Karl even said to Pivko in person shortly afterwards, "I regret that somebody wished to cast a shadow over one of my most valiant officers." On September 15th, Pivko brings news that his battalion will soon be transferred, so the Italians need to attack now. Finzi says it'll happen within 2 days, and Brigadier Zincone, in command of the troops, agrees to this. The Italians have 7 well-equipped army corps, a huge advantage. The Austrian side of the plan goes off like clockwork, and the road across no man's land is open for the taking. However, the Italian troops don't trust their Austrian guides, and though the advanced troops take Carzano, the main force hasn't arrived, and the road is deserted. It turns out that Zincone has sent his men single file along a twisting lateral trench instead of up the undefended road. As dawn approached, the main Italian thrust still had not arrived. In fact, Zincone suspends the operation, calls back his men, and abandons the forward troops and their guides. Pivko and 300 Bosnians are taken prisoner by the Italians, and the forward troops surrender to the Austrians. There is an inquiry into the matter, and Etna and Zincone are relieved of command. The whole thing was a fiasco, and Cadorna even said long after the war that nothing during the whole war had angered him as much as Carzano, and he had good reason to be angry for what could have been a decisive breakthrough and a huge morale boost instead became a complete debacle because of incompetence within the high command structure of the Italian army. And far to the east, as the week ends, British forces defeat the Ottomans on the Euphrates River near Ramadiya, capturing the Ottoman commander, 3,455 prisoners, and 13 big guns. So, all in all, a good week for the British in the Far East and the West, and a rough week for the Germans, and a failed attempt to give Italy an advantage by treason against Austria-Hungary, though that actually was last week. Something else happened this week. Well, today, now in 2017, today is September 28th, which means that it's my birthday. And actually, today, when this episode comes out, is my 50th birthday, which means I am exactly half as old as the events I'm talking about. When you think about it like that, this stuff doesn't really happen all that long ago at all. So let's hope we learned something. And happy birthday to me. Hey. All right. Hey, if you want to learn more about Luigi Cadorna, one of the secret stars of our show, you can click right here for our bio special about him. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Bernd Schumacher. Thank you for your support on Patreon. We could not do this show without you. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.
Thank you to Wargaming for sponsoring this video with their game World of Tanks, a massive online free-to-play tank warfare strategy game with over 150 million players worldwide. All of the tanks are true-to-life models with realistic upgrades that can be earned and applied as you enhance your tank as you progress. Strategy changes between vehicles and maps, so you can try out your baguette launchers on the steppes of Russia and the deserts of North Africa. Well, there were baguette launchers in North Africa at one point, but no one ever talks about that. Fall of France is more interesting. Take part in joint operations to spot, track, and destroy enemy units, and get revenge for those poor little destroyed French tanks by downloading World of Tanks for free here, and use my code TANKTASTIC to unlock a bonus T-127 Soviet bias machine.
Greetings all, and welcome to the next exciting installment of Chieftain Q&As, this one, number 31. Yes, I still have some questions to get back to from previous installments, but I am overdue, so it's just gonna add to the backlist. First things first, sales of the Emotional Support Missile, plush type, are about to end. Yes, shipping is still scheduled for February or March of next year, which at least gives the tariff situation a little bit of time to heal. We're not going to raise the prices due to tariffs. The deal is the deal. I'm just hoping that the non-US sales are sufficient to cover the costs of the US ones. Either way, as this is being released, there's only a day or two left to put in your order before the salvo of missiles is sent to swarm the globe. Alright, and on to the questions. Starting with Alexander H. And he wants to know if I have anything about the use of Churchill tanks in Korea. And the answer is not much beyond what's on Wiki. They weren't long for the place, together with the Cromwells. Once the UK could scrape together Centurions to replace them, they did so. This caused the Aussies much angst, since they were supposed to be delivered to them when the British told the ship to turn left instead of right, and it left a long mark on Australian procurement philosophy after that. The first British tanks to land in Korea were 16 Mark 7 Crocodiles of C Squadron 7th RTR, which supported 29th Infantry Brigade Group. The troopers left Southampton on the formerly German Empire Faui on 12th of October 1950, after 2 months were spent trying to get the things operational. At the time, the British had no other tanks to spare. The troops arrived in Busan 15th November, and the tanks eventually arrived, and so they went north, with the first troop leaving on 28th of November. Within only a couple of weeks, the fuel trailers for the flamethrowers were generally ditched, being considered more of a hassle than use, and the tanks were used as gun tanks. As soon as the first troop reached Pyongyang, the Chinese made life complicated, and the Churchills turned around and drove back down. The crews were very proud of being able to make 200 miles on their own tracks. The trailers, incidentally, came with AEC Matadors to haul them on route marches, but since the trailers had no brakes and were a bit heavy, the Matadors crashed a lot. The big Churchill engagement was at the Battle of Happy Valley, where the Churchills performed well. It is also where the British lost their Cromwells, one of which would later be destroyed by Centurions whilst being used by North Koreans. 11 20-pounder rounds fired beats 2 75mm apparently. During the Chinese push south, an ARV and gun tank were deliberately destroyed when the squadron commander was told he had to leave Seoul immediately. It turned out there was miscommunication. He actually had 2 days. Oops. After the UN forces got back up to the Han, the time of the Churchills was about over. They did do some cross-river engaging with indirect fire using a borrowed US Army L5 as a spotter, but were generally held in rear areas. The mechanical condition was horrendous. I can tell you that on the 8th of June 1951, there were 16 Churchills, quote, on security mission Kimpo Peninsula. There is also a comment in the archives from May of that year that the Churchill ARV was unsatisfactory, being underpowered and slow. They requested Centurions without turrets urgently to replace them. The lads from 7 RTR were sent home on 8th of October 1951 aboard Empire Orwell. Churchill did not do well in cold weather. Moisture got into the air servo systems and froze up. Even the grease in the turret rings would freeze solid, and eventually the grease was replaced with gearbox oil and straw was used to try to seal the gaps. If water got into the tank and made its way into the gearbox, which happened not infrequently during fording, the water would freeze and lock the gearbox. To fix it, you had to run the engine for a half hour to warm the thing up and for the ice to melt. Now, if you parked the tank in gear like you were supposed to, you then had to hold your foot down on the clutch for the full half hour while you were doing this. Eventually, they would be parked in neutral and they would use chock blocks to stop the tank rolling away. The extreme cold also negatively affected the track pins, which broke frequently. The tank's performance on ice was reportedly terrifying. A few tank commanders did find Bren guns to shoot from the turret roof. Falling steel. How do Soviet tanks with the auto-eject mechanism operate in NBC environments? Surely opening the hatch is a problem. So it's either the main case in a T-62 or the stub base on 125s. To answer that, I will hop over to the Soviet Armor blog, which addresses this directly. Short answer, your hypothesis is correct. The overpressure, combined with the short duration of the hatch being open, is enough to stop too many nasties getting in. I also wouldn't read too much into the line, they can always wear the mask as well. Even in the M1, we put on our masks as well as close the hatches and put on the Seaburn overpressure system. I mean, why take the risks? It's also not too uncomfortable, at least in the M1, as the tank system forces air into the masks, so you're not trying to suck in air through the filter. Robert Henry Ilston. Did armoured crews in World War II ever scavenge extra parts from knocked out vehicles? And if so, what gear was most popular to get extras of? And did they have to turn it back in once the commanders became aware of it? Usually less the crews than the maintenance guys. These days we have something called controlled substitution, and I'll refer you to my BDAR/repair video. Back then we'd call it cannibalization, either for parts or to cut up the hulks for extra armour. And I'm sure those extra caliber 30s that some tank crews had on their tanks on the turrets came from somewhere, but they could just have easily have been scrounged by some horse trading with supply or some other unit types. I do recall in my interview with Tom Sater, the one piece of equipment he was very glad he scavenged off a destroyed tank was a cooker, which he grabbed off a Panzer IV. Which makes a bit of sense. The US didn't lack too much of their own stuff, and you could always requisition or trade, but the stuff from the other side would have no equivalent. Am I going to cover more Italian stuff? Maybe if I can access it. There's not all that much Italian stuff outside of Italy, and I've not been in Italy in nearly 2 decades. Leon Peters Malone. What are the elements I think are most misrepresented elements of tank games? And what are the most misunderstood elements about tanks in games? Well, misunderstood bits are the bits you don't see, which is kind of self-evident, but also important. Bear in mind, tank games come in all shapes and sizes. You have arcade games like World of Tanks and War Thunder, and you have sims or sim-likes such as Steel Beasts or Gunner Heat PC. The latter show more than the former. If all you play are the former, then you have little appreciation for how a tank operates as part of a formation, alongside or against infantry, engineers, scouts, artillery, aviation, the like, and all the tactical or operational considerations which come along with it. If you play the latter, you are more likely to have these things, or minefields, or bridge limitations, or whatever. If you're really hardcore in a game like SB, then you can get into things like crew and vehicle coordination with a player sitting in each seat of the vehicle. And you get to try to do it all at combat speed. The techniques of things also isn't normally taught. I mean, sure, driving a tank is generally easy. I mean, it's a tank. But there is still a bit more skill to it than you get in a computer game. Even sim-level computer games. Now, I don't recall, for example, ever throwing a track in Steel Beast because I did a hard turn on soft ground. But then you don't have the same level of feedback from your tank in the game either. And of course, there's all that logistics maintenance stuff which just gets hand-waved in game because, face it, it's not all that entertaining. Tank Mechanic Simulator notwithstanding. Basically, even a mill-grade simulator, the closest to which we can play on our PCs right now is Steel Beast, will only get you so close. Mike Quinton. Since the US Army retired the wheeled mobile gun system, are other countries also moving away from cannon-based wheeled vehicle to something else? Generally speaking, no. Striker MGS was withdrawn from service as it was not deemed cost-effective to go to double V hull variants of the thing, as well as the costs of keeping the system operating correctly. That has little to do with the doctrinal requirements, as a tracked vehicle and a wheeled vehicle simply aren't equivalent. It's worth noting that in the initial proposals for MPF 10 years ago, the vehicles would be given to the striker brigades as well as the infantry brigades, even at the time that MGS was still in service. Yes, I will come back to this whole MPF thing in another video. There's actually a sequence of videos I want to release, but right now I'm waiting on the government to process a few things, and that's not happening right now because of the government shutdown. But the bottom line is that they have different capabilities. As a result, the Army has a choice. In a situation where a tracked vehicle is better, do they spend the extra money and effort into having a tracked vehicle, or do they just save the money and stay with wheeled as good enough? And if it's a situation where wheeled vehicle is better, then why would change? Certainly, wheeled gun systems, be they tank destroyers, maneuver combat vehicles, or assault guns, are still in vogue with little indication that they're going away. Also, are countries headed back to the era of the battlefield taxi similar to the AMP-V and away from IFV? No. Okay, you can make an argument for ISV, I suppose, although that just replaced walking or borrowed trucks. AMP-V is intended for support roles only. It's not intended to carry infantry around the battlefield. Now, that hasn't stopped BAE from slapping a turret on it, and it's a sort of a Bradley version 1.5, but I do note few takers. Bradley itself is not being replaced by AMP-V, M113 is, or at least was. Bradley is being replaced by XM30, which almost certainly will have a 5cm gun. That said, it seems that the current trend is more and more capable IFVs. It seems now that having a missile launcher on the IFV together with a cannon, as on a Bradley or Desert Warrior type concept, is actually becoming more accepted, given the amount of demonstrators out there right now which have them. Although in hindsight, I have no idea if XM30 is supposed to come with a missile or not, and I don't actually recall seeing anything on the matter. Even wheeled vehicles like Boxer are more and more likely to come with a 30mm, and look how many 30mm strikers are now being built. Adam Schindler! Eric Prince, I had to Google him, has noted several times the threat that drones pose on the battlefield. He has suggested that in addition to the more costly /finicky ammo dependent hard kill systems, nets can be an effective deterrent. Will anti-drone nets become the new heat slats? I don't know why, but the way a question was written reminded me somewhat of anti-torpedo netting on old warships, and it's close to that extent. Now, this question was posted before I released my Going Beyond the M in Drone Warfare video, in which some of this is addressed. But yes, I believe nets are going to be an issue, but more for the matter of stationary protection. Larger the tank, set up a net. Set up a CP, set up a net. To that end, it works similarly to ship torpedo nets. Though if you set up a good camo net, I don't see why you need to set up a fishing net. You'd think that it will get caught up either way, except maybe to cover the door. In terms of on the tank, though, I think it would only be a short-term solution. It's easy to implement and can be done quickly to provide some level of protection while everything else in the counter-UAS space gets sorted out. We are going to see more of it on NATO vehicles for a while, but I am unconvinced by the image of a battalion's worth of ISVs driving around with big projections of netting support struts, making them bigger by keeping those nasty drones sufficiently far from the vehicle that the squad will be safe. Whatever longer-term solution is found for the light guys will be applied just as easily, if not even more easily, to the armored guys. Joshua Bristow, what's my opinion on ADATs? Why was the system decommissioned by the Canadian Army and never replaced? How would the Bradley version have been different, and what difference would it have made to US Army armoured units? So ADATs is a bit of an odd one. The idea of an anti-tank missile and anti-aircraft missiles seems a bit weird, even given the existence of gun-launched ATGMs or Hellfires for use against helicopters. Plus, there are enough anti-tank weapons on the battlefield. I can't imagine there would be much appetite to lob some of the few anti-aircraft capable weapons at tanks, given the possibility that an aircraft might show up when you already have lots of TOWs and Dragons and Javelins or whatever else. Perhaps a more interesting question is, why did the Canadians buy it in the first place? Beyond, presumably, the fact that it would be built in Canada, which was its own scandal. The US Army made a valiant effort at getting the thing to work to acceptable standard, but 4 years after Canada had accepted it for service, the US was still saying, nope, not good enough. The primary problem with it, as far as the US was concerned, was reliability. Canada bought the system in 1986. In 1991, the US was averaging about 11 hours before something broke, and they were looking at a goal of 84 hours average before even ordering it into production, let alone fielding it, which required 117 hours average before something breaks. By the time the system was cancelled, Raytheon had identified 150 fixes to the radar alone, and the radar module was only responsible for 30% of the failures. Either the Canadians had something the Americans didn't, or they had had much greater tolerance for breakdowns. The US also had issues with the general design concept of the thing. There was talk of creating an armoured turret or shield, as it was observed that while artillery, for example, would generally bounce off the vehicle's hull armour, or indeed the armour of pretty much anything else in a formation, fragmentation impacting the rather large missile tubes would result in a rather sizable bang. Anyway, it turned out they had other concerns as well. Apparently the initial design concept didn't even consider anti-radiation missiles as a threat, for example. But anyway, let's assume that the Canadians found the reliability and vulnerability acceptable. or else I presume they wouldn't have bought it. Maybe they incorporated many of those hundreds of fixes. Come a decade and a bit later, with the Cold War over, and with a capable NATO air force, and more anti-tank systems like Eric's being added to the Extant Force, ADATs would have resulted in the same problem which plagued most other tactical air defense systems. The what's the point question. Every other nation in NATO seemed to be generally giving up on short-range air defense vehicles. Why would Canada be any different? Plus the rockets were probably getting old, maintenance costs continuing to go up. Time to get rid of them. There was a...
Be right back in about 4 or 5 minutes.
proposed replacement called the Multi-Mission Effects Vehicle, effectively an ADATS 2.0, but